India has a long tradition of trade, both internal and international. International trade can be traced back to the pre-Christian era. As we come to the medieval period, a notable feature is the growth of towns. Often, towns grow from villages. One of the chief reasons for this is the growth of trade. During the Sultanate period, which lasted from the early 13th to the early 16th centuries, the economy of towns flourished. This was due to the establishment of a sound currency system based on the silver tanka and the copper dirham. Ibn Battuta, the 14th century Moorish traveller, had visited India during the Sultanate period. He had described the teeming markets of the big cities in the Gangetic plains, Malwa, Gujarat, and southern India. During the Mughal period, due to relative political stability and uniform regional governance, trade increased. The rapidly increasing foreign trade led to the development of marketplaces not only in the towns but also in villages. The production of handicrafts, cotton, silk, and other luxury items increased in order to keep up with the demand for them in foreign countries.
First, we shall discuss the markets, different types, and then we'll go into the pattern of the internal trade. Actually, the market of the internal trade of Mughal India constitute a consistency over the years, increasing both in number as well as in the quality or its rich products. It had continued from the Sultanate period, particularly from the 14th century of the Sultanate period, from where we have accounts of the internal trade very much in details. There are different levels of markets. For example, if we take the low one, the village market. Villages were of two kinds, one might say. One, which are rather marginal in distant areas, difficult to access, but there are villages which are on the routes, either overland trade route or by the riverine tract. Now, in the later stages, the villages we have seen in other cases, they have their own markets, though small compared to the cities, but yet we see that they have the markets which can be called sometimes in Sanskrit hatta or in Bengali hat. That is, this is the type of market which sits for 2 or 3 days a week, where the products of the neighboring villages come in, and if these are in the trade route, either overland or riverine, then they may continue to hold for at least 5 days a week. But these are of small denominations. People go there for small purchases. Beyond this, or almost similar to that, the second type we might say, which are on the riverine tracts itself, depending on the type of crafts which are going. For example, we have the description of the mid-14th century Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, who was coming from Sylhet to Sonargaon in Bengal by the river Brahmaputra in a boat. And he said that there were so many markets on both sides of the river that I feel that I am going through the markets only. In the mid 16th century, we have the account of the traveler Caesar Frederici, who was coming to Sadgaon from the mouth of the sea. And there he found on the way of the Bhagirathi the markets on both sides of the river. But these markets, it appears, were not very consistent or uniform. They come at a particular season with particular products. So these are the two low-level types, we might say, of the markets. A much bigger one was a wholesale market, which in Indian language called mandi, M-A-N-D-I, which is really the wholesale market for trade, certainly, not only for consumption purchases of the local inhabitants, but more than that.
Most urban markets not only catered to the needs of the local consumers, wholesale and retail, but were also storing centers or entrepots from which dealers from other centers could get their supplies.
Now these mandis, which has been found almost in every pargana, at least one, in the Mughal Empire, these mandis, they are also there in the suburbs of the big cities. And the big cities were supplied generally by the mandis. We have many examples, some of which had continued even today.
This is the flower mandi of Delhi. Every day, beginning around 4 in the morning, traders gather here with flowers. Flowers come here straight from the growers as well as from traders. Both wholesale and retail trade takes place here. By about 9:30 a.m., this place will be cleared.
Now there are others examples. The growth of Patna, for example, after 1670 was partly due to the suburbs, which later became modern Patna, and this was due to the wholesale market or markets which were there in the suburbs of Patna. Now, the bigger cities, the next type of markets, are in the bigger cities where one has the wholesale market just outside the city. There was also the market for cattle and horses in Delhi, which was outside the walls of the city. But the city itself has certain internal markets run by internal trade also. And these are sometimes very much specialized. For example, in Delhi, we know that there were specialized items being sold in specialized streets. In one place, one could get sweetmeats. In another street, one could get equipments of war, etc. So we have in the city already two different types of markets. One is the mandi, which is practically the suburbs, and the other is the specialized markets within the city itself. There is the third type of market within the city, and that is a far more mixed one in the Maidan or Chowk, where in the morning and in the afternoon the shopkeepers come with their wares to sell. Bernier has given a very good description of such market of Delhi and Agra. But it is a mixed one in the sense that these were also the areas where professional people come. Nicolai Manucci, an Italian traveler of the 17th century, at one time became a professional physician, and he used to sit in the market and practice. In the 16th century documents, we have many references of this kind of physicians, astrologers, even poets in the markets of the cities. So therefore the markets are of different levels or of different types. On the river banks, in the villages, in the cities, big cities particularly, but there is also the small city, which is neither a city nor a village, although it is called a market town. Generally, this is very close to a big city, and in Persian it is called Kasbah, the name which has stuck since then. This Kasbah is a market town, but it is not a very specialized one. It is a generalized one, selling all kinds of things for the consumption of the inhabitants of the city.
So there were all kinds of markets, big, small, and everything in between. Some were specialized markets selling only particular items, others were general markets. In some of these markets, they sold not only merchandise but also talents such as music, magic, medicines, etc. In general, markets were places where many activities took place at the same time.
The number of such markets went on increasing in the Mughal Empire because of various reasons, which we would come a bit later. These markets are served by internal trade. This internal trade could be of two types, depending on the route. One is the riverine traffic, which is the generally used, and the other is the overland traffic, which is also there. Now, the riverine traffic is less costly, has less risk, but the overland traffic is far more expensive and it has risk. The risk is that in the overland traffic, the local leaders of particular areas, even the administrators, they impose a certain kind of toll or tax, which in Mughal parlance called rahadari. These rahadaris or toll taxes imposed since the Sultanate period had often been cancelled by the sultans or the Mughal emperors. Even Aurangzeb, as the historian Kafi Khan tells us, has cancelled a large number of rahadaris. But he also tells us that after a few years, nobody was bothered about the cancellation and the rahadari continued as it is. We have a very accurate description of a French merchant who was going from Surat to Machilipatnam in the second half of the 17th century, and he had to fight his way through different areas to avoid paying the rahadari itself. So therefore, the overland route was risky. The riverine traffic was preferred, as late 16th century traveler Ralph Fichte stated that he saw huge convoy of boats coming from Agra to Patna. He was obviously in one of those boats. But the fact remains that people for short distances like to go by overland traffic, for the simple reason that it is possible to go during the bad weather. The overland route has also another problem. Beyond South India, the bullock carts cannot go.
So, bad weather prevented riverine transportation. Rahadari discouraged overland traffic and bad roads prevented bullock carts. Then what was the mode of transportation?
They had to use bullocks to convey the luggage, the goods. For this purpose, there were tribes or groups known as Banjaras.
The Banjaras were tribesmen who moved with their families over long distances, sometimes with thousands of oxen carrying food grains, pulses, ghee, salt, etc., trading on their own or carrying goods for the bigger merchants.
They always do specialized trading, salt or rice, something like that, and then they go throughout the year, throughout the country with their packs of bullocks. One might say that they don't have any kind of permanent residence of themselves. They always live in tents, they carry their tents with them. There is a leader who gives order. And these bullocks of the Banjaras, they are also well trained in that sense to carry their goods. Some of the cities, because of the wholesale market and because of the villages attached to themselves, become famous for certain kind of products. Abul Fazal, in his Aini-Akbari, has given the list of the villages or land attached to a particular city. Almost all the cities have their lands. And the products of these villages or the land come to the city itself. And thus the city becomes a little bit of a parasite, as Irfan Habib says. It becomes a parasite because it takes the revenue from the village, then they take the product of the village with some kind of a tax. We know this kind of tax, the details of the tax, from a 18th century document of Cambay, where the details of the entry tax, the toll tax had been given. In this we see that mostly the provisions are coming apart from cotton, and in the provisions the melted butter predominates. Whatever the sort of production or the kind of trade, the fact remains that certain cities become important for certain products, although there are other products there as well. For example, Sajjadpur in UP was famous for making of paper. Rajasthan was famous for marble and other stones. Patna was famous for scented utensils and for opium and sulfur. Bengal was famous for silk. Kasim Bazar was the most important one, and Malda as well, and also for cotton cloth. Ahmedabad was very important for silk, and the foreign companies used to reside there, including the Dutch, for the purchasing of the silk. Certain villages become important because of their raw materials. For example, Sarkhej in Gujarat near Ahmedabad was famous for its opium. In UP, near Agra, a place called Biana was also becoming important till almost 1665 because of its opium production. So certain villages have raw materials, and these raw materials are carried into the cities, and the cities become famous because of their crafts, because of their production. Now, as a result, we see the growth of the internal trade. But this internal trade is not only between city to city. It has been stated that the internal trade of the foreign merchants of the East India companies of Europe started first in the coastal areas. That is, the coastal trade they used to do, and they made their money in the coastal trade before exporting these to Europe. The Indian merchants also did the coastal trade, and in the coastal trade we had all kinds of products. For example, the French used to send rice to Coromandel from Pondicherry in times of famine. There are other examples of similar nature. So therefore, the pattern of the internal trade depends very much on various factors, on geographical factors as well, on historical factors as well. For example, Surat had a very good overland route with Delhi and Agra. Cambay has also the same route. This route continued till the beginning of the Maratha-Mughal war. Once the Maratha-Mughal war started, this route was destroyed practically, and Surat had lost much of its internal trade and revenue.
But overland trade continued in other parts of India. For example, in the early 18th century, there was a vibrant caravan trade between Agra and Patna. Once a year, the Agra caravan used to come to Patna with various merchandise. This continued till the coming of Nadir Shah.
But there are other geographical factors involved in the change or the destruction of the routes of the trade. For example, Multan has a very good connection with the Indus River through a canal. But in the second half of the 17th century, the canal was gone, and the trade, riverine trade was gone also. There was an attempt to continue the trade between Multan and Sindh by overland route, but that did not last very long. So therefore, the trade, internal trade, although very prosperous in Mughal India and increasing daily, depended to a large extent on political as well as geographical factors, and also, as we see, on the demands particularly of export. For example, Machilipatnam had a very large hinterland, and its two products which are sought after by the foreign merchants as well as by the Indian merchants. One is the cotton cloth, and the other is a special kind of red cloth called chintz, C-H-I-N-T-Z. And chintz continued till the end of the 17th century, after which we find Machilipatnam in decline. There were other such economic factors, for example, for the growth this time, for example, of Kasim Bazar, the raw silk. It was a small village. It grew into a big village because of the abundant production of raw silk. But it did not grow into a city at all. In case of certain other areas, the internal trade helped. For example, in Gujarat, Cambay's was most important for cotton supply to Surat and Bombay, And Camby's center of cotton was a place called Jambusar. And this Jambusar was a small village in the early 17th century. It became a small city with a fort in the second half of the 17th century. It became quite famous in the 18th century. So therefore, the growth and the pattern of the internal trade depended to a great extent on various factors, particularly the increasing demand of production, the production itself, although the technology remained the same, the increasing urbanization and its demand, the growth of the export trade to a very great extent. Now, this internal trade, as we would see, remained at the same time bound in coastal areas also. For example, Bengal, Gujarat continued both as an internal trade and as an overseas trade, in the sense that from both Bengal and from Gujarat there was overseas trade itself. Then we have Bengal Coromandel, Coromandel Gujarat, Rajasthan Agra, etc. So therefore, certain trade routes were quite well marked, products were well marked, merchants were all known, and this internal trade and the pattern of the internal trade depended on various factors, including markets and the overseas demands of the products. Now, the growth of the overseas trade led to an increasing demand on the internal trade itself. And the internal trade increased to that extent, or perhaps more than that, because of the increasing production. And this increasing production was possible to a great extent due to the increase of agriculture and agricultural products. So therefore, the economy of the internal trade is linked to a great extent on various factors on the harmonious growth of agriculture and industry, growth of agricultural and agricultural products, growth of the demand in the urban areas, in the ports, in the overseas markets. All these were changed by the middle of the 18th century when the English took over Bengal. And then the collapse of the merchants, the collapse of the Mughal economy could be seen.
In conclusion, one can say that there were several types of markets and very brisk trade going on in the whole of the Mughal Empire. As Satish Chandra says, supply of food grains to the towns was an important feature of interlocal trade. Apart from foodstuffs, the villagers also supplied raw materials such as cotton, indigo, etc. for many urban manufacturers. Sometimes caravans of 30,000 bullocks moved under state protection for the supply of food grain to the army. Thus, there was a complex network between the towns and between the towns and townships.